Okay, yeah, I'm good.
So we are moving on, and now we have one more lecture by Welcome.
Okay, good. Brief introduction. My name is Ronny Scholz. I work at the British University in. Oh, I just.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry for those who couldn't hear me. I hope that's better now. So now we already coming to the second part of my lecture. So we have now in the previous part we have looked at some challenges, societal and research challenges. In this part, I want to maybe repeat or revise some of the theoretical concepts that might be helpful to understand internationally used terms better. One of which is the concept of formula, which is quite popular in the French discourse analysis. It lately has been coined by Alice Krieg-Planck. Basically, a formula is what we can say a term or a catchword that has a fixed lexicosyntactical unit, and so it could be one word or it could be several words. I will give examples in a minute. It has a social reference, so it refers to some part of our social life. And it is discursive in nature. It means it only acquires meaning in discourse. So we have to debate it, and then it becomes meaningful. It is also polemic at the same time, because it transports some challenge for the social context, and it is cyclic in nature. It means it appears in a certain phase, and then it disappears from the media sphere or wherever it is discussed after a while. Alice Krieg-Planck has worked on ethnic cleansing, because mainly she worked on ex-Yugoslavia, and I think also to some extent to the ethnic conflict in Rwanda. That was in the 90s, as you might remember. But I think nowadays we would also talk about the migration crisis as a formula, or Brexit, climate change. This would be all formulas in the sense that Alice Krieg has defined that term. Yeah, so now we have this concept of formula. I would like to connect it to Laclau-Mouffe's concept of articulation. So what is articulation? Is that real? Yeah. So articulation is basically, we can distinguish between, or Laclau-Mouffe distinguish between discourse elements and discourse moments. So discourse elements are signifiers, so word forms that haven't a fixed meaning yet, yeah? So they need to be articulated in a certain context, in a discourse context, in which they acquire a certain meaning. And this process is called articulation. And once they are articulated in this particular context, they are considered as moments of the discourse, yeah? That's at least how I understand it. Maybe you have a different opinion on that. So, for example, and that's how it would make sense in my thinking, yeah? So, for example, if you take the Brexit, in the Brexit, we all know the core meaning would be UK leaves the European Union, but in a particular context, in the UK context, it means also national sovereignty. For them, for the pro-Brexiteers, it means more democracy, freedom from Brussels technocrats, and also it could mean a new Scottish referendum. Yeah, so there are these different meanings that are also collocated or connotated with the term Brexit. In the German context, this would be a bit different. We would maybe find references to loss of partner in the struggle for neoliberal European Union, the fear of nationalism, and protectionism. So that is the German debate, that how it refers to Brexit.
Great deal of fear of nationalism.
Yeah, okay.
I say because it's such
So okay, I think you're totally right. I simplified here. I oversimplified maybe even. But what I think I want to make clear is that this positive connotation of Brexit doesn't exist in the German context, I would say. Yeah. So more democracy and sovereignty. Nobody would talk about Brexit in this positive way in Germany, whereas the Brexiteers argue for Brexit in that sense.
I mean, it's such a difficult issue. Today, I would say there's almost nobody in the UK having any positive idea of Brexit.
Well, I'm talking about the debate, not about what people really think.
Yeah.
And Johnson still argues with the same arguments as he did in 2016, I would say. Yeah. Well, I think okay. Okay.
I just don't want to leave this kind of set idea of UK.
Yeah. Well, no, certainly not. Certainly not. I think the last 2 years have shown that there is a real problem. But as we understand, we analyze discourses, I only rely on what on the material that is out there. So, as I said, I'm a corpus linguist, and I can only study what is in texts. And I think I would find these kind of connotations if we look for the meaning of Brexit in the British press, for instance. Okay, so now, if we put this articulation scheme on the international level, then we would have something like this international use of terms, migration crisis, Flüchtlingskrise, which is the German equivalent for migration crisis, that then are articulated in different discourses and then produce different imaginaries in each of these countries. And the thing is that we still think we talk about the same thing, but it has a different meaning in the different contexts. And I think that is quite interesting for discourse researchers. Yeah, we talk all about migration crisis, but in Italy it will mean something very different than in Germany or in France, for instance. And this, I think, can be also true for smaller groups. We cannot only look at nations, but maybe there are groups and communities in which certain concepts are articulated differently than others, or maybe even class differences. Yeah, the working class people and the middle class people might conceptualize these concepts in very different ways. So articulation depends on discourse communities, basically. Yeah. The next concept that I think is very important for articulation in order to understand why and how we articulate is relevance. Relevance goes back to a book of Sperber-Wilson, which was published in the 80s, I think, the first time. And here it helps us to understand how internationally used terms become relevant in a local context, and what are the conditions. And these guys, Wilson, are pragmatists. They refer to Grice. I don't know if you have heard about the maxims of communication, and they want to know how come that we find one information interesting and the other one is not interesting, or we don't see them and we don't consider it. Yeah. And they have a model. I think I would be unable to explain it in detail now, but what is important is the context and the knowledge in the memory, and also the provided knowledge in the information that we look at. So these are the two dimensions that are important to make something relevant for us as audience. And they refer to this context as assumptions. So we make assumptions about the information that is provided based on what we know about the information that is provided. and based on what is in the information. So they talk about a contextual effect. So if an information is relevant, it has contextual effect. Only information that has a contextual effect is relevant for us. They describe 3 cases, so that just to clarify what they mean by contextual effects. So the three types of cases where information doesn't have a contextual effect. For instance, the sentence, the 5th May 1881 was a sunny day in Kabul, has basically no contextual effect because it doesn't add up to anything we know already. So yeah, okay, we can say, yeah, so what? Yeah, so it doesn't add to any discourse, to any knowledge narrative that we actually have. The second case is when the information is irrelevant. You're now listening to a panel talk. You know that, so it doesn't add up to any of new. It doesn't give you any new information. And then the last type are information that is inconsistent with what is actually happening. You are fast asleep. I think I can't see anybody who is fast asleep. So that is contradictory to what is actually happening. Yeah. So that is also doesn't have a contextual effect. So. So in other words, in order to be relevant, an information needs to connect to an existing context, it needs to add new information, and it needs to be consistent with what we know already about a formula or a discourse. Yeah. So if we know already something about the migration crisis, then what we see on the news would add up. If that is not the case, the news discourse would have to create the concept of migration crisis. We have studied, I've worked on a project where we studied crisis discourses, and we looked at the financial crisis in the German press and how it became actually a crisis in the media discourse. And we could see very clearly in the beginning, the first month in September 2008, that the term Finanzkrise wasn't used very much, but there were lots of references to banks and countries, and so we needed a phase of description what this crisis is actually about. And then in October 2008 we had a peak for financial crisis, the term financial crisis, and that shows that at this time, at this point in the discourse, the concept was already established. And so at this point, the news and the media agents that talk about the crisis could actually refer to the concept of the term of financial crisis. So it had to be created first as a concept. People needed to know what is actually financial crisis when you talk about it. And I think that is true for many of these concepts. So then, what is important here, the second a part of this relevance concept is that in order to understand these global concepts, they need to refer to a location or something that is near us. Yeah, and Shilton has developed the eclectic space theory. That basically says that we make sense of a term by locating it in the world. So it needs to be somewhere around us. We need to know where it is and who does it use and so on. And when it is used, time perspective. In that sense, all these terms, they have a dimension of we and they, here and there, now and then. So there's this kind of mapping that we can distinguish. And then Piotr Kapp, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, he's Polish, has developed the approximation theory, which says we can actually relate very distant events to us by creating them in a crisis, a threat, or a security issue that exists for us. Yeah, then they become relevant and important to us. So making an issue relevant is making something known by either activating a particular context stored in the memory. So in Germany, we always refer very often to the Nazi time, and that has then all sorts of implications and is used to activate a certain memory and in order to conceptualize the present time, yeah? Or, as I just described with the financial crisis, we have to create the context of understanding by defining terms in the discourse context, by relating them to a certain world in the geographical space. Examples would be Europe, for instance. Europe is quite interesting because it has more than one core meaning that is present in our memory. It could be a geographical space, yeah, the continent Europe. It could be a cultural space, the social values that are related very often to Europe. But nowadays it also relates to the European Union, the political space. And sometimes political discourse uses all meanings and combines them in order to justify, for instance, the political union, the European Union. And I will give some examples in a minute. So, and the other side is that a discourse creates a meaning. Brexit is a totally new word that didn't exist before the campaign in 2016. So these are terms that have actually been created to describe a certain event. So it's a kind of a proper name, actually. Global financial crisis could be everything, but I think anybody who has worked on this would relate it to the 2008-2009 crisis. Climate change is also something that has to be created and described in discourse. And we have worked on the Bologna process. I think maybe you don't remember what that is, but it's basically the introduction of the masters and what is the other one? The master degrees, LMD, licence, in France is licence, master and doctorate, and the bachelor, bachelor undergraduate, so bachelor, masters and PhD degrees, doctorates. So that was started in 1999 and was a process over 10 years. And even now in Russia, I think you have also a kind of Bologna system where you have bachelor degrees and master degrees and so on. And we have looked how these concepts were used in it's kind of a career of these concepts, and we have compared together with Johannes the use of this term Bologna in the German press and in the French press. And what we see here in the black curve shows that in Germany this term had a quite steep career until 2009 when the process was finalized. And in France, in the French press, the career is very modest, I would say. It doesn't really take off. This term is not really used in order to refer to the higher education reforms. Higher education reforms is the pointed line here. The black line is the German line, and the gray one is the French discourse. So what we have concluded from that study was basically that in Germany, as it is a federal country, we are used to have this kind of concepts that tell us that is a natural process. We have to adhere to higher powers, a European process, and it's good for us, yeah? Whereas in France, politics is much more personalized to ministers, and that is because it's a central state system. And that was our argument, at least. And therefore, Bologna process, a process that is not referred to France itself, to the national state, would not be very interesting. So they referred to the same reforms, because they also introduced the three levels in different terms. They use different terms. And in France, normally they refer to reforms in the name of the minister who has introduced it. And that's why we have this difference. So what that shows is actually that relevance of terms and careers of terms depend pretty much on the local context in which they are used, and sometimes they are not successful. In this case, Bologna reforms is not very successful in the French context. Successful in terms of legitimization of politics. Now I give some more examples from my PhD thesis that I defended like 10 years ago, I think, but it's still interesting for that debate that we have here. So in my PhD, I looked at political parties and the election manifestos for the European Parliament elections, which take place every 5 years. The last one was this summer. And all these party acronyms that you find here are parties that had at least once in the 40 years of the existence of the Parliament a seat in the European Parliament. And I tried to find all their election manifestos and produce these three corpora and to study them with text statistical methods. But the methods are not so important today. What I want to show you is just sentences in which Europe is defined. And these are, well, it is defined in more sentences than those, but very naively we just start by looking at sentences that contain the n-gram Europe is, Europe c'est, and Europa ist. And I was interested in how the three different corpora combine these three core meanings. I've said we have Europe as the continent, Europe as the community of social values, and Europe as a political entity, the European Union. So I give you some example sentences. What I wanted to know is what are the effects of combining different meanings. So, for instance, here in the French case, as Jacques Chirac said, Europe is above all a common civilization and the consciousness that all our people are a part of it. So that is the Gaullist party. The German corpus, a similar statement. Europe is more than the European community. People that are deprived of freedom, and ethnic groups in Middle and Eastern Europe are part of it, as well as the free people in the other parts of the continent. So what we have here mainly is a reference to the community of social values and Europe as a political entity. In the German case, I think you could also refer to the core meaning of the continent, to some extent at least. But what is actually the argument here for is that because Europe has certain common characteristics, there is a need for political integration of the continent. So I think that it becomes clear as an implicit message in both of these citations. So in the British case, there are quite different references to the continent and the community of social values. 3 examples here. The Green Party believes that the only sure way to lasting peace and unity in Europe is to foster and build upon people's sense of regional identity. So that is the Green Party, which supports then all these different countries in the UK. Increased assistance, credits, trade agreements, and security cooperation must all be used to ensure that this difficult process is achieved and that peace and stability is maintained. We must ensure, however, that increased assistance to Eastern Europe is not at the expense of help for the third world. So here again, the reference to Europe as a continent and the peace and stability as social values. Europe is simply too diverse, and the historical obligations of member states differ too widely. Our solution: peace and cooperation. So here again, you see that we refer to the continent, but it is a diverse continent. So there's no argument for unification of Europe to some extent. Cooperation, yes, but not unification. So what we could conclude, or the argument that we could deduct from this is, on the continent Europe, we strive for certain social values, but this does not necessarily create the grounds for political unification. I would interpret these sentences like this. Yeah. Some other more examples where the British discourse refers to the political union. Europe is now affecting more and more our lives. The Channel Tunnel 1992 and the Single European Act make it essential that Scotland has a voice at the top table of Europe, defending our interests and taking full advantage of the opportunities for Scotland within the European community. And then the Labour Party in 2014. But if Britain's future in Europe is to be secured, we know that Europe needs to work better for Britain. So here again, it's a location, Europe, the continent, and our geographical location fosters actually our political distance to Europe. Yeah, that's what we have seen with the reference to the Channel Tunnel. If you go back, and here, if Europe, Britain in future kind of also puts a distance to Europe as of which they could be a part actually. And what is also very clear in the British corpus, that for them, for the British press here, Europe is constructed as a geographical space, and political agency in the UK stays actually with Britain. Yeah, and the European Union has to serve Britain. That's so the UK discourse. Yeah, and I want to look a bit more at the agency aspect of Europe. Can Europe be a political agent? In Germany, certainly yes, because here we see it is already in a subject position. Europe is in search for future perspectives. So here actually Europe has a very agile identity, obviously. The next sentence from 1999, Europe is not only an economic, but above all also a community of values. Our Europe is committed to the high social and ecological standards on the regional, European and international level. So in all three examples here, the term Europe is a sentence subject and has a very strong agency. We wouldn't find those sentences in the British corpus. Here, Europe is rather a location, or it's put under a condition. Yeah, innovation is essential if Europe is to compete successfully, and if Europe is to deliver them, it must change. It's no unconditional acting of Europe. A social Europe is not just about working conditions. Our vision of a new Europe is not the single market with its barriers removed, but a wider Europe with the Berlin Wall dismantled. So these are all examples of a weak agency of Europe. Yeah. So we have these conditional clauses if Europe is to succeed, or negations what Europe is not. So, but it doesn't mean that we know what Europe is actually. And we also have a construction as a vision or a target of Europe. So that means that Europe actually is not finished yet. It's still a project, and we are still working on it. So it also doesn't give Europe a certain agency. And then we have the adverbial use, Europe as a location and not a subject of the sentence. So in the British corpus, we clearly see that it has a weak agency. Yeah, I think I gave enough examples actually. Maybe one more for the British case. Yeah, what is also striking in the British corpus is that we see that Europe is the location, but on the other hand, the British political parties are the strong agents. Yeah, so sovereignty is always with the British parties. These are some other examples. I won't read out them. Whereas in the French case, we have also the opposition, we have also an opposition where Europe is opposed or compared or put into context with the nation state. And what we see here is that Europe is actually important to defend French interests. Europe and France have a strong agency. Okay, good, thank you. For 15 minutes, I think I will manage. We'll see. Okay, so here in the French case, we have seen in the British case, Europe never has a strong agency, but in the French case, that is the case because for the French discourse, Europe is something positive. Europe is supporting actually French ideas, and that is an old Gaullist concept. That's why actually de Gaulle was a strong pro-European politician in the 60s. So what we can see here in this example of the term Europe, formula Europe, is that we have all the three core meanings. They are combined in different ways, but they still because they are combined in different ways and conceptualized in a different way, they produce different meanings and totally distinct ideas about what Europe is and what Europe is good for in the local context. And what we can also see is that all the semantic elements that dominated the referendum campaign existed already at least since the 1994 election periods. So just to summarize that part, in order to create relevance for Europe, it needs to be constructed in the national context, and only by comparing these, as you have seen, by comparing these text sequences, we can actually understand better what is at stake in political terms in these different countries. And we can understand. We can try to trace back those arguments. Why does the UK want to be sovereign? Why is the sovereignty in UK so important and Europe so unimportant? And why in France that the same idea is constructed in a different way? And why in Germany actually this aspect of nation state and Europe is not important at all? And if you think about it, we have to go back to history and political reasons that have actually convinced people to join the European Union. We can also go back to institutional context, the cultural context, and the historical context that kind of can explain those phenomena that we have just observed. So in the next 15 minutes, I want to go to the second part. Maybe do you have questions so that you don't fall asleep? Very short questions. Do you need any explanations or no? I think that was rather clear. Yeah. Okay. Good. So in the last 15 minutes now, try to be ready. I want to refer to I want to come back to the challenges that I outlined in the beginning, and I think what we have looked now is about the how to look at this internationalization aspect, but we have also the digitization and social media and the idiosyncratic knowledge production. And I have to say that maybe we need to have more effective ways of communication. And one of those effective ways of communication is our discourse scenarios. Yeah, and one very popular discourse scenario we find in this slogan, "Make America Great Again." I will explain why I think that is a discourse is a scenario. Yeah, unfortunately, Donald Trump is one of a politician that makes very much use of these discourse scenarios. Yeah, he's a speaker that talks in images, basically, I would say. He uses metaphors very much, but also these scenarios. So I take him as an example to explain what are discourse scenarios. But I think discourse scenarios are not only used in populist rhetoric, also other political activists and politicians use them. Here is what I did for this analysis. We looked at U.S. presidential campaign in 2016 and looked at all speeches that were held by Mr. Trump. There are about 74 speeches, and this sentence alone has been repeated in 28 cases. Yeah, so you see that he very well prepares his speeches. Yeah, and what we see here, some elements of a discourse scenario. I am going to fight for every citizen of every background and every stretch of this nation, and I am going to fight to bring us all together as Americans. Imagine what our country could accomplish if we started working together as one people under one God, saluting one American flag. So we have here a political activist, political object, the citizen and the nation. And we have also a time perspective. Well, imagine the future and geographical space, the United States. And that reminds us again of the what was it? Paul Chilton's concept of the space and time theory. So what we see as elements of a discourse scenario is the political subject, political object, political action, time, imagined future, and space. And all this is used in order to persuade the audience, the electorate, to vote for Mr. Trump. Yeah, so what is a scenario? So scenarios are assumed representations of specific situations. Sanford and Garrett referred to them already 20 years ago as something that exists in our memory. Then Mussolf developed this concept of a metaphoric scenario, where he says, okay, that actually scenarios are mini narratives about a particular scene that contributes to the metaphoric configuration of concepts. And we can also understand scenarios as idealized cognitive models, ICMs, that refer to a source, a path, and an aim. This was described by Lakoff in 1987. So a discourse scenario, in my view, is different from those in that it refers more to political space. Yeah. So in political, it's more specific in that it refers to political action and legitimizes political decisions. And it has implicitly or explicitly a certain direction and an extent of the action. And it leads, as I said, to persuasion, justification, and legitimization of political aims and actions. So there are different types of discourse scenarios. I go very quickly through them. We have scenario of threat. Back again to this election manifestus corpus. Here a sentence: only a unified Europe is strong enough to master its future, and so on and so on. So what is political action is unifying and securing, and what is under threat is the future and the interests and the other aspects of liberty and so on. So we see that social values are very important if you want to talk about these scenarios. So maybe in order to be a bit quicker, I think that is very clear what is a scenario of threat. We have also crisis scenarios. Those of you who are familiar with the Brexit discourse, here we are again with Boris Johnson. He says, we have a national health service in crisis. So that creates a certain idea about the reality. And then he provides a solution. Brexit will mean money stays in Northwest for us to decide how we spend it. And it would be at least one hospital a week. So here we see that he creates a certain reality and provides a political solution to it. Even though he never would consider to open hospitals every week, yeah. Even you rather would privatize all hospitals, I think, if he could. But his argument is now just, Brexit. Then a third type are visions, utopias, and prophecies. Here again, the EP corpus, our vision of Europe is a common space of freedom, stability, and prosperity. So here again, an argument for the European Union. Based on these social values, yes, freedom, stability, and prosperity. Everybody would agree that that's something good, and that's why the Europe will also be something very good. And we also find this in these other examples. So what is actually crucial here is that there is a direction of action. It can be a protection. We want to defend or to shield. That is when we have a threat. It can also imply an aggression, an attack, or abolishment of something. And in the third case, we have rather a creative space that is argued for. Yeah.
What is the one narrow threat and narrow crisis? I frankly don't see how we can divide.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think all these are kind of linked to each other, yeah? Sometimes we have overlaps, but sometimes we have just a threat of a crisis, and sometimes we have a description of a crisis that's there, and that then creates a discursive space, I would say, or argumentative space in which we can lay any political demand. For instance, as we have seen in 2009, it was suddenly possible that within days $7 billion could be released in order to save the banks, which wouldn't be imaginable under normal circumstances. So because there is a creation of this crisis scenario, which is not a threat anymore, I think, because it is there in the description, we then can argue for these extraordinary political actions.
Am I right in saying that crisis, the real chapter dimension of time
Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe if you want to have a time order, you would put the scenario of crisis in the first place, whereas the last two are actually future visions. Yeah, then one is negative, the threat, and the other one is mostly positive connotated. Yeah, a vision or utopia, mostly well, or it could dystopia could be also a threat. You see, there's a kind of overlap between these phases. There could also be a threat of a crisis, which would be then a scenario of threat. Yeah. But I think there could also be more types, but these are the three types that I came across in my very short research career. Direction of action, so that is a direction of action, but also we have the extent of action. Yeah, as I just explained, that the global financial crisis asks for a different extent of action than a local issue, like there's a risk that the dam will break or something like that. Yes, the extent of political action that we argue for is different in both cases, and they are also implied already in the construction of these scenarios. So just to schematize a little bit, I would say that there are certain there are discourses that refer to certain needs, which could be material or immaterial, social values, ideas, and these are put into a time and space context. And we have a certain knowledge that is based on a discourse. So the discourse participants have a knowledge that is based on discourses, and based on the knowledge of the discourse, they can create subjectivity related to discourses. And the same applies to politics. They somehow have to relate to these needs and the discourse, the knowledge that circulates in discourse, because they want that the electorate votes for them. They have to try to meet the needs of the electorate. So, for instance, if there is a crisis discourse, we would expect something like political answer that addresses the issue of crisis. So how do we go into the future? And that's why these scenarios are very strong in arguing and activating, mobilizing voters and political activists. Because they identify themselves, they have a desire, emotions, and it can be mobilized. Yeah. So that if we go back to Johannes' lecture in the morning, that is basically a concept that refers to Pecheu's idea of identification and subjectivity. Okay. Yeah, so now maybe last point that I want to make is that what we have seen is that there are controversial claims that are linked then to uncontroversial claims. Yeah. So, for instance, change the immigration law, repeal and replace Obamacare, climate change is not man-made. So these are all controversial claims. And in order to make them valid, in a scenario, they would be linked to one of these aspects: peace, freedom, maybe economic prosperity. I have it here: a strong nation in prosperity. That are all things that we wouldn't debate about. Yeah, we would agree. It's something that is good. And if we can achieve those things by doing these things, and then we are kind of persuaded and convinced that these are good political claims, and that's what happens in scenarios. And this idea goes back to an old philosophical concept, the practical argument by Tullman, You can read up on that yourself. I think what is important that this concept was then in German discourse analysis, especially in the Düsseldorf school. One prominent figure here is Martin Wengler. This has been developed into topos analysis. So he says there is a controversial statement. The asylum law needs to be changed. It's controversial, yeah, we can agree or not agree. Okay, I think I will exceed a little bit. Then we have the variant. If the asylum law is abused by many, it needs to be changed. Yeah. So if that is the fact, then this has to be addressed in the conclusion. And that happens also in these scenarios. I take here this example. What we can see is that actually the political action, the controversial claim, can be replaced by other plays. Here we have unified Europe, but it could also be only unified Germany is strong enough to master its future. And you see, the sense is completely different, but the argument is still true, yeah? The same could also apply if we just put there Donald Trump. Only Donald Trump is strong enough to master our future, and so on. So you see that the rhetoric power it's still there, and this means that the political claim is replaceable and arbitrary. Okay, I don't think I need to go into this thing. I just concluded on Trump's campaign speech, but this is maybe not necessary. Let me conclude the talk. So with the functions of discourse scenarios, they have a communicative function. They reduce complexity of politics. They persuade audiences. They unite very diverse audiences behind one vague political claim, which I think very often is an empty floating signifier. The social values are very vague. They are not debated or discussed. We don't know what, if you say we want freedom and happiness, what that actually means, yeah? Then the analytical function for us as discourse researchers, they are interesting because we could dismantle these scenarios into their elements and unveil their arbitrary nature. That's what I just did by replacing these two claims, yeah, the controversial and the uncontroversial claim. We can then connect these linguistic phenomena with political claims. Then, on the other hand, we have to understand that the discourse has an impact on people, and concepts like climate, globalization, digitization, and so on. These are real changes in society. They create existential fears, and existential fears, if these fears are addressed, they mobilize existential emotions. I think that is what's happening in the current situation of the political crisis. And what is lacking here is a text type or a genre of text that explains the complex problems that are hidden in these scenarios, actually, yeah. So that's what we had before when we had the rational discourse about origins of political problems, of climate change, and so on. I think the scenarios, they don't help us to explain those problems, but they are very effective in this just-in-time communication. So they are very easily to be reproduced in social media. And they deliver immediate and simple answers. And so what is the strength of these scenarios is they can actually create alliances across societal fissures. They can make clear what are our general social values that we want to live by. But what is missing is the debate about the practicalities to reach those goals beyond manipulation. Yes. Yeah, I think I can skip this. Maybe we can leave that for the debate. Maybe this issue will come up in the discussion if you have any. So if you're interested in the methods that I use for my research, you should buy this book or get it from the library. I just edited it. It's not that I wrote a couple of texts in there. But there are mainly quantitative methods that are combined with qualitative research methods, and it came out just in January, so it's quite recent and up to date if you're interested in methods. Yeah. So I'm now ready to take questions. How much time do we have left?
Honestly, 3 minutes.
No, we had agreed on 80 minutes in total.
While waiting for pizza. Yeah. Oh,
But then you didn't inform me correctly, because you said you correct me at 60 minutes. So now we should have actually at least 10 minutes for questions. 10 minutes, okay. Then. Any questions or comments? Or you're all tired, I guess.
I have comments and perhaps some ideas of discussion. When you present this model of two levels, basically transnational and the national discourses, one of the interesting things of these debates in Western systems is as these debates continue, some of the systems get increasing crisis. And so what we see is the solution of democratic institutions to some degree, to some much important matters. And I read it to Brexit because and if you have a look at what's happening in the UK, what I think is really interesting is a paradoxical consequence of this whole debate about the place of Great Britain in the world and all that. You realize that the nation state is in deep crisis as they go on with their kind of anti-European discourses.
Who is they?
I mean, Brexit.
Yeah.
And so in fact, the democratic institutions are under pressure. I mean, Parliament may no longer be consulted. The different nations, the coordination of the are perhaps splitting away. So there are all kinds of very fundamental risks for the British nation state, which now became very obvious now that the nationalists are in power and nationalist opinion. And so I feel it is really kind of important to be aware of the destructive character of any claim of nationhood. It is very kind of misleading to think that there's a natural basis of discourse, which is the national sphere.
Yeah.
And then they connect or not to something fanciful.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the UK, you see a very fundamental split within kind of English-speaking basic communication. You see the very different regions, and you see the very massive threat to precisely that thing that was presented as a national which in fact turns out to be very weak.
Yeah, I think that's why I try to emphasize the aspect that this the lower level refers to discourse communities, and those can be nations or language communities, and language communities also in the sociolinguistic sense. So we have different classes or different regions that talk differently, that use maybe different dialects. I think, and then obviously, as we have already established in the talk during the talk, is that my picture is not complete. Yeah, there was also an anti-Brexit discourse, which was not represented in my example, because I wanted to demonstrate a certain aspect of this phenomenon. Yeah, I think we cannot say that one nation is equal to a discourse community. That's a very important remark, I think. Yeah.
Basically, all your presentation really focused on the strategies of predication and argumentation, I would say, if we see both wonderful. But what strikes me the most is the strategy of nomination, because we were talking about Brexit, but the very word Brexit was artificially constructed, and like it is already full of some meaning.
Yeah.
The same with your example of migration crisis, because
Yeah.
migration crisis in English is not migration crisis in German, because
Yeah.
it's totally different.
Yeah.
Rules.
Yeah. 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 Okay, that is the lexical part of the study now that I didn't emphasize on. But you're totally right. We could also already start by having just a look at the lexicosemantic of the core meanings, or having this a kind of historical view on what is Flüchtlingskrise as opposed to migration crisis, and what were maybe historical uses of those concepts. What I think I would use these quantifying methods for is trying to create a corpus and then look for collocates that influence the meaning of those terms, and then already also get this kind of discourse semantic perspective on the concepts and what are the differences between them. I have done this previously, but I didn't demonstrate it today. Yeah. But yeah, that would be a starting point. But I was more interested in the persuasive power of phrases, actually, that construct these concepts, these formulas. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I can't hear you. What's democracy? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, he basically what he creates in his book, he formulates a critique of neoliberal discourse, or yeah, I would say discourse, but me. Yeah, maybe even earlier. Yeah. Mm. Well, I think the results of neoliberal politics, we are still facing them. Yeah, the neoliberal political agenda didn't end 15 years ago. It's still ongoing, and we still see privatization and the same discourse. I think even we had this financial crisis, and now the austerity measures haven't changed really any of the political agenda that was linked to what he was criticizing in his book. That's why I think we still can talk of post-democratic societies, even though now we have even more problems, things like climate change, the new geopolitical situation, I think, which he didn't mention in his book. So obviously there are even more challenges now than back then, and as Johannes said, the nation state is under much more pressure now than back then. But I think he already described this exactly the phenomena that you were talking about in his book. So I think it's still a valid concept. Okay. Yeah, thank you for your attention. I was a bit afraid that at this late time you would really fall fast asleep, but it didn't happen, so congratulations. Thank you. Okay.
And the other day, about 15 minutes.